Hi, I'm Suze with Community Forum, and I'm also with Sage Leadership Strategies. And my host today is Jeremy Stein, the Executive Director for Connecticut Against Gun Violence. Welcome, Jeremy.
Hi, Suze. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you for coming on the show. And here we are Monday morning with yet more news from another shooting over the weekend. And I'm not sure what the exact latest stats are. I heard 175 shootings in the year. Either way, it's more than 2 a day. So what would you say in terms of the state of affairs on this situation in this country?
Well, gun violence is definitely a public health crisis. It has been a public health crisis for some time now. We are seeing a lot more publicity around these shootings, these mass shootings. The string of shootings that has happened over the last couple of weeks, you'll notice has happened in southern states. Those states like Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee are states that have very weak gun laws. Some of those shootings could have been prevented just by passing some of the laws that we have in Connecticut. So while there is a lot of tragedy and there's a lot of feeling of hopelessness, there is a lot to do. There is a lot we could be doing.
So, Jeremy, I know you're in your role for 6 years now. This is the third time we're having you on the show, so thanks for coming on again. And there's currently pending legislations in the state of Connecticut. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that. And my understanding is that some of the laws in Connecticut are as such that could have prevented, like, for example, the shooting in Nashville. So can you speak to some of the pending legislations and some of the great work that your organization's been doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this legislative session is very exciting. The governor has introduced a 90-page gun violence prevention bill with the help of the legislation that has passed the Judiciary Committee and is now awaiting to be called in the House. And some of the things that we are hoping will pass this year are a strengthening of our safe storage laws to make sure that people are storing their weapons regardless of who's in the home. Right now we do have a safe storage law, but depending on who you have in that home, whether it's children or a prohibited person, determines whether or not you need to lock up that gun. And safe storage is one of those things that most or if not all responsible gun owners, at least, realize is something that you need to do to take on that awesome responsibility of gun ownership, is that when you're not using it, it should be locked up to make sure that people who would harm themselves or others don't get access to that. That's not only just children, but that's other people as well. Some other things that are in that bill are a $2.5 million appropriations for community level gun violence prevention to make sure that the Department of Public Health has the resources to be able to invest in community level gun violence prevention strategies. Those are types of things like gun violence interveners, as well as mental health services. And then we've seen also a strengthening of some of our existing laws, making sure that we tighten up our assault weapons ban, our ghost gun ban, domestic violence laws are strengthened, as well as many other aspects of this bill that will save lives. And like you said, some of these laws that we have in Connecticut could have prevented the Nashville shooting. Something as simple as permit to purchase laws, or an assault weapons ban, or our red flag laws, also known as risk warrants in Connecticut. Those types of laws save lives. And if any of the states that have seen recent shootings had just one of those laws, it may have prevented some of those shootings from happening.
Okay, so can we unpack some of all of what you just said a little bit? So maybe let's start with safe storage. So you referred to it as, it sounds like there's a little bit of discretion and judgment there in terms of a gun owner, meaning consider who you have in your home, and does your gun need to be secured away somewhere, locked up. So folks who are vulnerable, such as young children, we have enough stories where innocent children have gotten a hold of guns. So what is the discretion with that safe, safe gun law storage, excuse me, and how can you really monitor that?
Well, some of it's about changing culture, right? So, our laws, it is hard to enforce laws unless you are going door to door. Typically what happens is our laws are enforced because the police are called to something else, So for instance, what you find is a child brings a gun to school, right? Unless that child brought the gun to school, police might not know that the parents aren't storing their gun safely, right? And so, but that does not mean that the law shouldn't be enacted, and it doesn't mean that it isn't working. Of course it's working. Had those parents been required by law to lock that gun up, then the child could not bring the gun to school. They couldn't get access to it. So it's an important distinction to note that sometimes our laws are enforced, through other through other laws as well.
So Jeremy, in this instance, it sounds like for a safe storage law, the reality is the only way that you really know if it's being adhered to is if somebody violates it. Like you said, nobody's going to go door to door auditing somebody's home. And of course, gun owners would never allow that. So the only way that you really know about it is if somebody who should not have access to that gun gets access to it, whether it's somebody who's wrestling with some mental health issues and maybe they're going to be of harm to themselves or others, or a young child, a minor, has access to that gun. Otherwise, how else do you really know if the gun owner is not adhering to safe storage of that gun?
Well, I mean, it brings up a point about deterrence, right? And when we're talking about deterrence, we're talking about our laws. The truth is that most people want to abide by the laws, and laws change culture. When if you take, for instance, seatbelts, right? People said, well, how are you gonna enforce seatbelts unless you actually stop every single car on the highway? And we have enacted some checkpoints, and sometimes police officers will notice someone driving, but more times than not, what happens is that there is an accident, somebody gets hurt, and then that's when they realize that somebody was not wearing a seatbelt, or they get pulled over for speeding.
Jeremy, I want to pause you there. That's a good analogy, because now, I mean, I've never in my life, I think maybe once did I ever get in the car without putting on my seatbelt. It's just like automatic. I was trained that way when I learned to drive. So was there anything that like you looked at and that you learned like that is a way of life, wearing seatbelts, in terms of how the culture got changed around that? Like that's a great analogy. So did you study or look at like some of the challenges culturally? Because, not only, even if we go back to like the 50s or 60s with the speed limits and in terms of speed limits enforced and enacted in this country, I mean, that's an ongoing thing, people getting tickets, but at least there are some deterrents, as you were speaking to. So what other kinds of analogies or lessons learned, if you will, can you bring into play here?
Yeah, I mean, motor vehicles is a perfect example, right? So we know, oddly enough, gun violence, guns are actually the #1 killer of children in the United States right now. It's no longer motor vehicles, right? And once upon a time, it was much more dangerous to drive on the roads. It's not that it's 100% safe, but what we did to reduce the number of motor vehicle deaths is we instituted national speed limits. States have lowered their speed limits in some areas. We have created airbags, anti-lock braking systems. Cars are now made out of different materials. The roads are better. We have statewide police forces that enforce the laws, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these things help to make driving safer. It's a combination of the laws, technology, and enforcement of those laws.
So it's a multi-pronged strategy, such as what you're saying, even with this pending legislation. I just wanted to highlight that. Okay, go on. I don't want to interrupt you again. Go ahead.
So, taking all of these, gun violence is a multifaceted problem as well. And so we need to have a multifaceted approach to combating gun violence. And in a similar way, some of the things that we could be doing to reduce gun violence, we're already doing in Connecticut, but we need to do more. And so some of these things are restricting access to firearms by certain individuals, training individuals, making sure that before they get their hands on a gun, they're trained to do that. We just saw a recent shooting in Alabama, and there's no training that is required before you can purchase a gun. You just need to be 18 years old in order to acquire a firearm. No background check, no training. Anyone can access a firearm. So things like training, safe storage, making sure that when they're not being used, that guns are safely stored away. That does not mean that people can't get access to guns when they need them. It doesn't mean that they can't have a gun in their possession. What it means is that if they're not using it, that it should be stored away. Just like police officers, when they come off duty and they come home, they don't just leave their gun out on the kitchen table. They take their guns that they've been using all day long as part of their job, which is very important, and storing it in a safe area with their ammunition separate, so that their family members or their children don't get access to that. Other things that we've done in Connecticut, similar to that analogy, assault weapon, right? Assault weapons. These are weapons that are designed for warfare, and it's the analogy is like we don't let Formula One race cars be driven on our highways, right? We reduce access to certain motor vehicles that might be too dangerous to drive or might cause accidents. We require inspections of our motor vehicles. The point is that we don't have unfettered access to whatever we want. There are limitations, and assault weapons are one of those things that they should not be in the hands of civilians. So
Connecticut clearly has been a leader in should I say, this movement around gun control or safe access to appropriate access to guns, because obviously a lot of the gun owners are Second Amendment. This is our rights. This is our rights. And if we look at that, it's like in the context of, what's appropriate in our society, such as what you're saying is you're not saying take away their guns, just take away certain guns that what in any way, shape, or form should be a reason for an average citizen to have assault weaponry that can decimate somebody in 2 seconds. I mean, it's different than having a rifle or a pistol or, a hunting rifle. So, yeah, I mean, it just seems kind of, it just makes sense that, but there's a lot of movement to try to prevent that, though.
Well, look, there's nothing in the Second Amendment, or at least the current interpretation of the Second Amendment, that has ever said that access to assault weapons is guaranteed under the Constitution. And quite the opposite. In fact, even Justice Scalia said that the government can limit what kinds of weapons people have access to. Right now, the only guarantee that you have under the Constitution is that you have access to a firearm for the purpose of defending yourself, and then that right is extended to beyond the home. The Heller decision said that you can have a gun in your home. That is your Second Amendment right, and that's since been extended by the recent Supreme Court decision to say that that right now extends beyond the homes for people to have a firearm. Nowhere does the Constitution, and has there never been a Supreme Court that has said that that right extends to assault weapons or machine guns. It seems to be limited in nature, and it also seems to suggest that the state has an absolute right to be able to limit some of that access, to require training, background checks, et cetera, et cetera. That has always been the interpretation of the Constitution, that the state does have rights to protect safety. Recent interpretations have been slightly different, but it is pretty clear what the law is in this country, and regardless, it makes perfect sense that we limit access to weapons that were specifically designed for warfare.
Yeah, I mean, it totally makes sense. And I think what's happening is in this country, I mean, you and I live a stone's throw from Sandy Hook, and, we know that was 10, 11 years ago. And a lot of people are just getting numbed or fatigued to yet another dramatic shooting. Coming back to this pending legislation in Connecticut, you also talked about community level gun violence prevention strategies. Can you speak to some of those? And if we look at it from an evidence-based perspective in terms of how they do make a difference, and can you speak to some of the progress that Connecticut has, and Connecticut also being a leader, hopefully, and a role model in this space in terms of trying to create some change across the country?
Sure. While there seems to be a lot of media around these mass shootings, these school shootings, that doesn't change the true reality, which is the majority of the shootings that happen in Connecticut are either suicide or community level gun violence, meaning those types of shootings, those almost day-to-day shootings that are occurring in places like Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, and in other cities that mostly affect Black and brown communities. And that's really the gun violence that we need to be concentrating on. And suicide by gun is also even higher than that in most months. But this community level gun violence, we need to make sure that we are investing in our communities. We need to make sure that we are looking at evidence-based strategies that are going to increase quality of life and look at root causes to gun violence. Yes, it is about access to firearms, but it's also more than that. It's also to make sure that we're looking at why there's such a demand in some of these communities for gun violence, and what is missing in some of these communities that we should be providing as a society. Some of the groups that are doing this type of work are concentrating on focusing on those individuals that are most likely or that are actually are perpetrating gun violence in their communities, as well as making sure that youth are part of this equation. We've seen an increase in youth violence, and some of these groups are talking to youth to make sure that that they know that there are better options, that teaching them that resolving their beefs should not involve the use of firearms. But to do this kind of work, it's not just about saying, hey, just say no. It's about making sure that these communities have the resources that other communities have, and to make sure that children have proper education, that they have housing, that they have proper food, mental health resources.
Yeah. So Jeremy, here's what I'm wondering. Your organization has done a lot in terms of trying to have appropriate usage and access of guns in one sense, right? In another sense, you're talking about, okay, let's look at the root cause. And so people using guns and using the kinds of guns and targeting either themselves or others is clearly a sign that there's a lot of distress in our communities. And so such as what you're speaking to in terms of getting at some of the root causes and offering some other services for, can I say, like a hurting world. And so how are you also in a way expanding beyond like your core mission in terms of partnering with other organizations? You mentioned some of this pending legislation in terms of training, awareness, domestic violence in communities, and also in some marginalized communities or underserved communities. So are there other ways in which your organization is supporting or partnering with other organizations that kind of are attempting to provide more, I'll say, social support and intervention?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's about at least 50 other organizations that are part of what we call the Connecticut Initiative to Prevent Community Gun Violence. Many of these organizations are literally boots on the ground organizations. They do a lot of the work sometimes when we sleep. They're violence interveners. They are talking to people right before violence happens. Some of this work is done in hospitals after a shooting. Some of these organizations respond to a hospital to talk to the victim and family members to try to make sure that any chances of retaliation are limited, but to also make sure that these families have the resources that they need. Sometimes something as basic as, how am I going to pay for my son's funeral who was shot in the street, is something that some communities never have to deal with, and some communities are always dealing with. Is how do I pay for a funeral, or how do I even survive day to day dealing with the aftermath of gun violence? So some of these organizations they delve in prevention work. Some of them are intervention work, and then others provide aftercare for survivors, which is really important if we're going to break the cycle of violence.
So heart-wrenching. I mean, and you live with this every day in terms of working with so many different stakeholders and constituents, from, government, community, families, victims. From a leadership perspective, you've been in your role now 6 years. I'm wondering a couple things. One, how do you keep yourself focused, motivated? Because clearly you're passionate about it, and it's a mission and a calling. So how do you keep yourself sort of right focused when you are constantly out there, whether it's consoling families, coming up against these horrific, tragic scenes? And so I want to know how you keep yourself motivated, and where you feel like, if you could sum it up in terms of the journey you've been on with Connecticut against gun violence in these last 6 years, the progress that you've made, and how you continue to have hope that more and more progress will continue to be made.
Well, I think we've had a lot of successes in Connecticut and around the country. I mean, we've seen many different gun laws get passed that have reduced gun violence, but also, we know the laws work as a result of Connecticut having some of the strongest gun laws. We have also some of the lowest gun death rate in the country. We know that those states that tend to have the strongest gun laws also have the lowest gun death rates. And so we know the laws work. And so, while we have legislators in the Connecticut Assembly that are champions on this issue, and we have a governor that is a champion on this issue, there is a lot of hope. There's a lot that we can do to prevent gun violence, and to make sure that common sense laws, life-saving laws, are passed. And we have been very successful. Some of that has a lot to do with elections. We've been fortunate in Connecticut that the voters have spoken, and they want this to be a key issue, and they want legislators in the General Assembly that are going to vote for common sense laws that are going to save their lives. We need to do the same in Congress. While we have great legislators, great senators and Congress people in Connecticut, there are parts of the country, in some of the states that I just mentioned, Louisville, Kentucky just saw a mass shooting, and Mitch McConnell is from Louisville, Kentucky. So we need, voters need to be better in those states as well, and we need to make sure that what we're doing in Connecticut is replicated. That what we have done in Connecticut is a model that works. And this needs to be done around the country. We need to pass these types of laws in all 50 states. Yeah,
so that's what I was going to ask you, in terms of the average citizen who, may be, numb to it, or just, disheartened or whatever, in terms of what they can do. And you're saying vote, which, make sure we have the right people in office who are going to affect the right laws and pass the right different kinds of social outreach support programs, et cetera. Anything else in terms of individual citizens can do to try to feel like they have some kind of effect or control over making a difference? And anything you want to say around this pending legislation, in particular in Connecticut?
Well, I think the most important thing that people can do is make their voices heard. We're having lobby days every Wednesday for the next several weeks at the Capitol, where people can come and speak to their legislators and help us lobby. But even when
if somebody was working and they couldn't take off work to get there, what else could they do?
You can email your representatives. You can text them. You can go on social media. You can follow up. You can also, sign up with Connecticut Against Gun Violence. Go to our webpage on CAGV.org. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. But the most important thing that you can do is on election days, whether it's a municipal election, a general election, presidential election, that is probably the most important thing that anybody can do to combat gun violence is to vote, and to make sure that people who care about this issue are running for office. And that, above anything else, is something critical that needs to happen. On a good day, we see maybe 60, 70% of people who are registered to vote showing up to vote, which is less in a primary. And that means that 30% of people are not having their voices heard. And in some elections, only half of the people are showing up to make their voices heard. And we need everyone to show up. Our lives depend on it.
So in terms of your agenda for this next 6 months, can you highlight like your top 3 priorities? And then we have 1 more minute with that. I'm going to give you a double barrel. Your top 3 priorities in the next 6 months, and just repeat how somebody may contact you or your organization again before we sign off.
Yeah. So first, did you say double barrel?
Sorry. I'm so sorry.
I want to point that out because it's one of these things where, how many times do people shoot each other texts, right? We hear this all the time. Gun violence has been ingrained in our language, right? Every day. And it's something to notice, right? This has become American culture now, and there really needs to be a change. But in terms of our priority list, first and foremost is definitely to make sure that community level funding within the Department of Public Health not only is there in the budget, but we also believe that $2.5 million is a drop in the bucket and should be increased to $10 million per year. That is more in par with what other states are spending on community level gun violence. We spend about $90 million every year on gun violence after the fact. That's hospitals, police, et cetera, et cetera. And if we spend a little bit of that on prevention, we can also save lives as well as save money. The other thing that is important to us is safe storage, as well as strengthening our assault weapons ban, our extreme risk protection order, and as well as our ghost gun ban. So those, while there's many, many things in the governor's bill, those we think are the most important things to make sure that those are voted on and passed this year.
Okay. And can you give your website or how people may contact you again?
Sure. It's CAGV.org. That's www.CAGV, just like the sign, .org. And you can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and everything else. I think we're on TikTok too.
Okay. Hey, all of them. Okay, Jeremy, thank you. And my apologies again for that word usage, but it is so embedded in our culture, and I'm glad you called me out on it. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for coming on the show. Until next time, I'm Suze Shaner with Community Forum.